Hitler and Mussolini coming into power, what they did. Talked about the Germans invading countries and, well, just one more, and they just kept on advancing. Then they signed an agreement with Russia that said they're not going to invade Russia. Well, they wound up invading Russia. So then the Italians got help from the Germans. They were invading Ethiopia, places like that. Last week we talked about December 7th, 1941. Someone tell me what happened on that day.
The bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Bombing of Pearl Harbor. Very good. Now, we had Delbert that was here, a survivor that was there. His ship was out, not in the dock there at Pearl Harbor at the time, but he came back and seen the carnage and everything that was happening there. What was the one ship that was lost that's in tomb there right now? Arizona. Very good. Do you remember the other two ships that were damaged, heavily damaged there?
The Oklahoma.
Yeah.
The Nevada.
Very good. So, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, none of our aircraft carriers were there. Battleships, destroyers were there. Subs were there. Delbert talked about his small vessel that he was on was there to help. The airfield was hit twice. They were going to have 3 attacks on the Pearl Harbor, but it didn't happen. They only had the 2 waves, so it attacked. Well, now we're kind of, as the old saying is, we were caught with our pants down. We never thought this was going to happen. We tried to stay out of it. We already knew what was going on in the Pacific and in Europe, but we try to stay out of it. Same way like we tried to do during World War I. Stay out of it, but eventually will pull us into it.
Try the side, red or green.
There we go. The U.S. fights in the Pacific and the Mediterranean area. I want most to talk about the North Africa campaign, and then Mr. Short will talk next week about Italy and the other parts. So after December 7th, 41, Franklin Roosevelt has this big speech, and everybody heard, this day will live in infamy when he gets in front of everyone in Congress and he talks about, we're going to declare war on Japan. We declare war on Japan, and then Germany declares war on us. So it was, boom, as soon as it happened, then they declared war on us. Well, now we got to figure out which fronts are we going to wind up fighting. We're going to fight 2 fronts in the Pacific and Europe, or are we going to, how are we going to do this? Well, Churchill came up with an idea that let's try to take the weakest part, people that that his people have been fighting for a while, that he's been losing. He said, if we combine our forces, the United States and the English and all the Commonwealth, to fight, we can try to win the first part of the battle. Okay, so they decided to do that. But in the Pacific, they're like, we got to do something to show them that we, the United States, you touch us on our land, we can touch you on your land. So I'll be talking about that. After Pearl Harbor, there was a scare of any Japanese Americans that were living in the United States. You see a lot of them out in the Pacific coast. Washington State, Oregon, San Francisco, LA, California area. And Hawaii itself. They actually had camps, the internment camps they put them in. And it was them to watch them make sure that they wouldn't do anything sneaky. And it's the same way today. You hear about the argument of bringing these Syrian refugees from the civil war that's happening over there and bringing them here. But how people don't trust them because of the terrorists. Well, this is the same thing. We don't know these people. Even though they might have been born here in San Francisco, California, with UCLA, graduated with a degree in engineering, but because he is Oriental descent, we don't trust them. And they had to leave their homes, their businesses, and they shipped them off through the West, and they actually had all these internment camps. That's what they called them. They were run by the U.S. government. They had soldiers that guarded them. When these people got there, they had these huts, homes they lived in. A whole bunch of families lived together. Kids grew up. They had schools for them. They had chores they had to do. They worked in them. But they wanted to be, we are citizens. We are citizens. But they gotta, but they still don't trust them. So they're like, well, we gotta figure something out before they can trust us before we're on their side. One of the most highly decorated units was the 442nd Infantry, Japanese American unit. These were men that were Japanese descendants. They got together, they formed up their own companies, and they went off and fought. Well, you're not going to send them to the Pacific because they could trade. They think they were going to trade, so they wound up sending them to Europe, Italy, southern France, and Germany. Like I said, they were mostly highly decorated unit. They had 21 Medal of Honor winners. They fought in the mountains in Italy, took heavy casualties, but they wanted to prove that says no matter what, we're Americans and we're going to fight for the American flag. With the internment camps that we were talking about, 62% of people, of U.S. citizens in Hawaii and in the Pacific West Coast had some kind of a ancestry of Japanese Americans, so there was a big population of them being moved out. In 1942, the Executive Order 9066 by Roosevelt started the internment camps. He had them in California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, Wyoming, Idaho, and Colorado. And some of them are still monuments there talking about them. But the 442nd, when they formed, they fought, they were hard, and these guys got respect for what they did. Here's them getting their honors after one of their ceremonies. And I mean, we watched over the German Americans, especially in towns that had a very German influence, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, places like that. There was reports where these men who were born in the United States, but they had their names in Germany because they lived there at one time with their families, and they would actually get draft notices from the German government to come back and fight for the Germans. A friend of mine, his father-in-law had one. He said, I'm not going back there to fight. I'm an American. I might have been born there, but I was raised in the United States. So I'm going to fight. So he wound up fighting for the United States. So there's a lot of hostility of how everything's going, everything. Like I said, they're just this group, when you read more onto it, I was reading about them, and they were, besides being highly decorated, these guys were fighters. And they had to they went through the whole war, and besides being just soldiers, they had to live with the racism of who their people were. The 192nd, 193rd Tank Company, they were National Guard units before the war in 1940, November 1940. And they knew what was going on in Asia, in the Philippines and stuff, so they took these guys, gave them brand new Stuart tanks, were kind of the high-tech tanks of its time, and they combined them with other companies, or National Guard units, group from Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, and Kentucky. The Ohio group is Port Clinton, which is up in the northern part of Ohio, and the one from Harrodsburg, Kentucky, which is southeast of Lexington, Frankfurt area. This is them in their drill. So now they're sent over to the Philippines, and at this time the Japanese they're fighting in the Philippines, and they're taking all these small little islands. And Manila is up here, but they were taking all these islands, and eventually the United States will come back in and take all these islands back later in the war. But Manila is where the heavy fighting was going on with the 193rd, 192nd, 194th. They fought up there, and they were with MacArthur and his men, the Australians, the British. Was it French that were still there at that time? Okay. I know they were fighting, and they held for a long time, but when you get cut off and you can't get resupplied and everything, they had to keep on falling back. Well, the tank battalion, they did an awesome job of the retreat. They had their tanks, they would fight off to the last possible minute and move back. Fight a little bit and move back. But they were eventually getting pushed back. When you got a notion to your back, you can only go so far. So, the troops eventually ran out of fuel for their tanks. They were supposed to go to a certain area to refill up. It was overtaken by the Japanese, and they lost their hold on the Philippines and Manila area, which then that all fell, and then the Japanese took over. Here's the troops surrendering the Philippines. Now, I'm not going to show you any of the pictures of what they did for guys who fell and things like that. But these guys, you got to remember, this is early part of the war, 42. These guys are young men, and hopefully when we get toward the end that Jeremy will show you what a lot of these guys look like being there for 3 to 4 years in a POW camp. And, I mean, they were young men, they didn't know what was expected. The 192nd, or the group out of Port Clinton, Ohio, they wrote letters home, and they were put in the newspaper. Yes, we arrived here, yes, we're fighting. And every week there was a newspaper or a letter from a soldier. Well, eventually when Manila fell, the letters quit. No one knew what was happening to their families or happened to them overseas. So they were worried about it and everything. And eventually Douglas MacArthur had to leave, and he went down to Australia, and he said, I will return. And eventually he does. But with the 192nd, I mean, they were there, and they held, and they got captured, but no one knows anything about them. They don't know if they killed in action, wounded, POWs, no one knows because of the communications. Here's the monument at Harrodsburg, Kentucky, of the tank. I got to meet one of the veterans who were in there in 1999. They had an anniversary, and they had 10 guys left. So I got to meet one of them, and he was telling me a story about right after they were captured, how the Japanese treated them. And they said they were real nice at first to get their trust, but then when they started moving them, how brutal they got. And he says, I always remember that. And he says, the only thing we were fed was rice. So some guys were eating rice so fast because they were hungry, it expanded in their stomach, and they got sick. They would fall off the side of the road. Well, he said, I learned growing up on rice during the Depression, when you eat it, you grind it up before you swallow it. You get all your nutrients, vitamins out of it and everything, and it doesn't hurt you as bad. But he talked about that, and he says, I can't eat a single thing of rice now from that, because I remember that. He has memories of that. So, really nice gentleman. You can tell, I mean, he said he weighed 135 pounds. He was 18 years old when he got captured. When they liberated his camp, when he got out, he weighed 97 pounds. And he said the heaviest he ever got was 102. So, the not getting enough food and everything, it takes a toll on your body. All right. We'll talk about Doolittle Raid. After Pearl Harbor, like I said, we were talking about how we got to take. Now we're going to take the war to Japan. How can we hurt them? Well, it's a big distance, and with everything falling out in the Pacific and everything, how can we get out there to hurt them, scare them? Well, Jimmy Doolittle came up with an idea, and they figured out let's put planes on aircraft carriers, bombers. Never been done. B-25 small bombers, and these are some of the men who were volunteered to do this, and they practiced and practiced. And these guys didn't know what was going on. All the other young gentlemen, Doolittle did, and the other commanding officers, but they kept on practicing. Short takeoffs, lighten your load. They didn't know what was going on. So they kept on just going through drill, and eventually found out they're going to be put on a ship with these airplanes, and you're going to be taken off on an aircraft carrier, which has never been done before. Smaller plane has on other ships, but not on an aircraft carrier. This is Jimmy Doolittle, and he's holding the medal here. These are the B-20. Did I skip one? This is the B-25s put on there. See if they're tied down. They're on the USS Hornet. They were going to go and they were going to invade Japan, attack them, scare them. Well, they were out here with these small planes, and they got far out, but they got sighted. And they actually had to take off sooner than they wanted to. So to make more room for fuel, they were taking other things off the plane. I mean, they were taking extra armament off, plating, radios, guns. They actually cut down broomsticks and put them out the turret in the back to make it look like they had guns, just to scare the enemy if they were seeing it. But they had to figure a way to make the lighter load for them to carry more fuel. And the whole idea was they were going to attack Japan, then go into China. Even though the Chinese and the Japanese were still fighting, but we were still allies with the Chinese at the time, and they would help us get back. Here's Colonel Doolittle attaching his Japanese medal to return back to the Japanese people. And right here in his hand is the medal. And this was a medal that was given to him in the 20s from the Japanese government. And he felt like, well, this is gonna be a payback for what you guys have done, and I'm gonna give this back to you. So the raid takes place. Like I said, they were sighted by a small fisherman's boat. They did report back, but they didn't know, so they took off. And if you ever seen any of the videos of this, I mean, these guys had a full throttle, and then the first one, when he came off, he went down, and they thought he'd wind up, and he came close to hitting the water, but he got enough where he could go off. So the guy in the farther back had a little bit more time, but it's still a short runway. So they wind up going across, and they wind up hitting Tokyo. They were hit buildings, they needed to be hit, scared the Japanese to death. Americans are hitting us now. You know, we'd hit them. I guess now it's fair that they're hitting us. And it worked. They lost a few. They had a 15 crash in China. One plane landed in the USSR, the Soviet Union. 3 of the 80 survived. 8 captured by Japanese in China. 3 were executed. And the group that landed in the USSR was held for a year, which is normal protocol for the Russians to do that when they would always capture someone usually. But they captured them, they held them there for a year, then they were released. But the Chinese that were helping them were the Chinese army, the regular people. Well, the Japanese were so upset over that, they were sending people into China, and they found out you helped them, they were killing them. So eventually they come back as heroes. But these these pilots and navigators and everybody who was on these planes, they wind up sending mostly to the European campaign. They didn't want them to be out in the Pacific. So now we kind of show Japan, like, you can be touched. You touched us, we can touch you. And that was how it kind of, the whole thing. Now it's going to start. Sullivan Brothers. The Sullivan Brothers picture you'll see in propaganda papers and then posters and stuff, and it says, remember the Sullivans. 5 brothers from Iowa. And 2 of them was already in the Navy, and the rest of them joined the Navy. Well, they came up where you cannot have relatives all in the same group. Different companies was okay, but you couldn't all be together at once. And the reason why these gentlemen were all on the USS Juneau at the Battle of Guadalcanal, and they were hit by a submarine that torpedoed their ship and killed each one of these men. And they went down. They said, remember the Sullivans. My second cousin was on the same ship that they were on, and he was one of the survivors. They had very few survivors of the ship. They were rescued. These men died. So the father, Thomas, was getting ready for work, and he seen 3 men coming to his house, and he knew what that meant. And they told him. The family was very upset. But his mom and dad went out, and they toured around the United States to sell war bonds. And I'll be talking about war bonds when we get to the home front part of the class in a couple weeks. And they went around and they supported they go to USOs shows. They go with they go to schools. They go anything to raise money for these drives and stuff. And it was a propaganda. And we later, when we are on Iwo Jima with the flag coming up the mountain, Suribachi, and that was used as another propaganda to get us our spirit. The other one says, you know, he has his hand out, make more bullets, things like that. And that happened, but this was a propaganda thing. It's awful you have to lose a life to use propaganda, but it's also the other people were doing it for the other side of the military or other countries. But this is something we did here in the United States. And if you go through the museum, you'll see different propaganda, how to support soldiers, buy war bonds, scrap drive, things like that. Battle of Midway. Okay, well, like I told you before, our aircraft carriers were not there. Battleships, destroyers, all of them were there at Pearl Harbor. So now we're going to hit, and we're going to actually start the assault in the Pacific, one island at a time. Well, we have Midway here. Here's Hawaii, so we come from Hawaii down. And the Japanese have soldiers going up, and eventually these soldiers wind up going up to Alaska. Then they go into Midway, and then the fleet down here goes into Midway. I didn't know a lot about Midway myself. I mean, I've studied it briefly, but it was June 3rd through the 7th, 1942. The codebreakers found the translation that the Japanese were using and knew where the next attack was going to be. And the Japanese were being pushed like, you didn't destroy any of the aircraft carriers, but we need to have another big victory like we did at Pearl Harbor. So Nimitz, which I'll show here in a minute, he planned an attack with his naval fleet, and they come in with Corsairs and dive torpedo bombers, and this is probably one of the major big battles of naval battles during the war. And some of the bombs we were using were still not up to date. We had problems getting them to explode, but eventually they figured them out how to get them to work better, put extra fins on them like they did, the Japanese did in the shallow areas of Pearl Harbor. So they started working, and eventually the Japanese lost 4 of their carriers And those carriers were the ones who launched the planes off the ships that attacked Pearl Harbor. Now the Japanese are hurt. Now they're losing. They lost a lot of their ship. I mean, they lost 3 or 4 destroyers, and then a couple battleships. I know they lost 4 aircraft carriers. I think they lost 2 submarines. So that was a pretty big blow to the Japanese. Here's Admiral Nimitz. He actually got his first start in submarines. And during World War I, he actually learned a lot about the submarine part because we were just starting to get into that whole process of better ice in the submarines. But Nimitz is real big. You'll see him at all the major, pretty much all the major conflicts in the Pacific. One of our aircraft carriers, the USS Yorktown, at the Battle of Midway, it was lost. You see it being capsized here where it was hit. Some of the older aircraft carriers had wood decks, and they caught on fire when explosions, planes wrecking into them, anti-aircraft, artillery shells were hitting them, and they lost a lot of, they were losing, but they prepared them. Eventually, you're going to hear about other big ships, the Enterprise, the Hornet, things like that, but the Yorktown is always one special of the ships. Okay, so remember I talked about Winston Churchill, and he talked about how we wanted to go into, we need to hit somewhere, and then the Russians were asking us, why don't we go there to help start them? Well, let's hit 2 fronts, but the equipment and everything was, we still had a small army, we were getting bigger, but the Marines and the Australians that were here at Guadalcanal, the island here at Guadalcanal, the Marines that were sent there, the naval, we didn't know really what to expect. And they took over a airfield that was being constructed by the Japanese, and they took over. But the equipment we were using was still equipment we were using during World War I. The 1903s, shotguns, the trench shotguns, the Enfields, the water-cooled machine guns, the BARs, Thompson machine guns. Well, the first guys that were getting sent there, the Marines that were sent there, they, the first wave came in, didn't hit anything. Second wave came in, but every time the wave, it got a little bit farther because the ships started getting hit. So the ships had to go a bit farther back. And there was times where guys were on the shoreline inside the jungles there, and they were being attacked at night. And they couldn't get resupplied. And it was a really bloody battle there at Guadalcanal, but this is one of our first major victories. It was a blow. After Midway, we started hitting and then eventually we're going to hit every island that the Japanese started taking. We're going to island hop and start taking them back. Here's some Australians that captured a Japanese machine gun. Here's the Marines. The gentleman right here, he's a famous Marine, Medal of Honor winner. His last name's Phillips. What's his last? Sid Phillips, Medal of Honor winner, and he was one of the battles that he was in. But this is a picture of him, and I'm not going to explain what he's doing, but that's him. So, the fleet has done well. I guess we lost the Yorktown, but we're starting to catch steam in the Pacific. Now, eventually, we're going to get held down in some other major battles and everything, but fighting the Pacific and on these islands is different than what we're going to see in Europe. They got jungles and the rain and the humidity and jungle rot and things like that. And then in Europe, they get snow, rain, mud. So there's going to be a big difference on each side. Now we're going to talk about North Africa campaign. Field Marshal Montgomery, British, and Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Rat. Both of them fought in World War I. They never met each other until then. The British and Churchill asked the Americans for help in North Africa. We can hit North Africa and take it over. That's one less country, or one less area you have to worry about. But the British were losing so many men and kept on getting pushed back so much by the African Corps and by the German African Corps. They were getting pushed back, and they just could never. They seemed like they get ahead, and they had to fall back. Well, Montgomery took over. They were doing fairly well. They actually used mirages to fake the Germans out at times to make it look like they had more tanks. But then they actually started asking the United States when we got into the war to help us out. One of the stories about, if you read through World War II, you'll hear about Patton, other officers not liking Montgomery. But Montgomery was arrogant, but he had his good points at times. Rommel, through his whole time through the North African campaign, did really well. But the supplies were running out. They were getting pushed back later. And Hitler would never keep on resupplying, and he kept on asking and asking and asking. Eventually, Rommel winds up leaving North Africa, sent to France to run the defenses in France, which will be where Normandy is, and he was the one who set up the whole defense line on the coast. First Battle of Alamein was a heavy engagement of the British and the Germans, and they did fairly well. The Germans did, holding off the British, the Australians, the Moroccans, and it was a tough battle. But they held what they had until we could get there, and eventually we're going to have our engagement, Operation Torch, Operation Torch, which will be our invasion that we will hit, and we will help the British, and we will eventually take over North Africa. Here's North Africa. You have Libya, which you hear all the time in the news. Egypt, we know all these areas from now. But there was a lot of fighting in here, deserts and everything, and you got to protect the sea coast. You got to get your supplies. Now, the second battle, Alamein. Yes, I misspelled Alamein. You had Germans, there was Italians, there were Vichy French, which were soldiers that surrendered and swore to the Germans that they would fight for them. Well, eventually, when we invade, they wind up surrender, or they didn't surrender. They wind up giving up to us, and then they wind up joining on our side. We had Australians, Indians that fought for Greece, company from Greece that was an independent. So they started fighting here, and these were protecting the rail lines and the coastline where we would get some resupply. So I was kind of doing this quick talking. There's so much to talk about during this. This is the first Division U.S. Infantry Big Red 1. And they were around during World War I. And they had heavy engagements. They landed in North Africa, and they fought all the way through. And you'll start seeing them. They were in North Africa, Italy, Europe, D-Day, all the way into, they liberated one of the concentration camps. I can't even remember the name of it. But they were heavily engaged quite a bit. So you ever see a soldier still, when you ever see them out, and they still use the symbol on their badge on their arms. Mr. Short's going to talk about some of the artifacts we have up here and a little bit more about the North Africa campaign.
Go back to the map of North Africa.
The second one, or
Keep going right there.
okay.
All right, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Everybody stand up for a moment. Shake it out, shake it out, shake it out. Shake it out, it's warm up here. It's warm up here today. All right, take your seats. All right, I need 2 volunteers, thank you. You 2 right here. All right. We're gonna talk about some veterans that participated in the North African invasion. And North African invasion occurred, I got a uniform for you to hold, pal. North African invasion occurred on 7 November 1942. The Allies, the Americans landed amphibiously and by parachute. A lot of air power over there. How many people know what a Spitfire fighter plane is? Some of you do. Spitfire fighter plane, single engine Rolls-Royce, British manufactured. Del Schaefer from Germantown, Ohio, was a young pilot assigned to the 309th Pursuit Squadron. He always wanted to be a pilot. He applied for the Air Corps in 1938, but they wouldn't take him. On December 8th, 1941, they took him because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was assigned to the 309th. They were issued Spitfire Mach 5 fighter planes. He flew the air defense of Gibraltar. Anybody know anything about Gibraltar? I highly encourage you to get online, look it up. Really unusual topography or terrain feature there. He flew air cover for Gibraltar. He flew air cover for the Dieppe raid on the Canadians in 1942, doing a feint against Normandy. But he was involved in the invasion of North Africa. And he shot down 4 Italian and German fighter planes. This is General Schaefer on the left. That sketch was done overseas by a French artist. And General Schaefer was the kind of guy, he's a real little guy. He wore cowboy boots with his uniform. That's one of his flight jackets. General Schaefer stayed in the service and retired as a Major General. And importantly, after that, he was a mayor of Germantown. But by the end of the war, he had shut down 7 German Italian fighter planes. General Schaefer had 202 combat missions, which was incredible for a fighter pilot. So he flew air cover for Operation Torch. Is that getting heavy, guys? We got to work on the PT a little bit then, don't we? All right, very good. Thank you. Give them a hand. I got some more things for you to hold. All right, 2 more. I'll get 2 more victims, 2 more volunteers.
These two people.
Thank you, you too. Thank you for volunteering. Come on up.
You're welcome.
So, we're going to talk about the parachute attack in North Africa. And you guys hang loose here. An American unit in England at a site called Land's End, England. The 509th Parachute Battalion, 600 men, flew from England to North Africa. They flew 1,500 miles in old C-47 2-engine transport planes. Fuel was an issue. The planes didn't carry enough fuel to get them there. So the aircrew took drums and rigged up siphoning hoses, put extra drums of fuel inside the fuselage of the aircraft. So these 600 men and about 45 aircraft took off. Many of the planes got separated. This is very early in the war. The United States is inexperienced. Our guys, these aircrew have not been in combat yet, so they were learning navigation. Had a serious issue with navigation. Celestial navigation using stars, dead reckoning, fuel burnage, all that kind of good stuff. So they flew 1,500 miles. Some of the planes got separated. Some of the planes landed in Spanish Sahara. They were interned by the Spanish. Interned means they held them. They released them later to go back to the war. Spain was neutral. Some of them landed in areas occupied by the Vichy French, as Justin related. Who are the Vichy French? Vichy French. Who are they?
Were those the French that turned, like, for the Germans?
France was overran by the Germans in 1940. Part of France was opposed to the German occupation. Vichy French accepted the German occupation and allied with the Germans and the Italians, the Axis, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next class. So, North Africa, Italians, Germans, and the Vichy French. The 509th Parachute Battalion, their objective was an aerodrome called Tarafi. This was a Vichy French aerodrome. It had French fighter planes. As the battalion continued on to the airfield to do the parachute drop, probably lost 25% of the planes. Lost. The first American killed fighting in North Africa was killed by a Vichy French fighter plane. His name was Tommy Wells. He was from, Tommy McCall from Wellsville, Ohio. And he was killed by a DeWitt fighter which strafed the transport planes. The planes broke up. Some of the planes landed, some of them dropped their troops. But he died of his wounds. First American killed. The Americans parachuted, landed, seized the airfield. 2 weeks later, the French turned sides. The French decided that the better part of valor was to ally themselves with the Americans and the English and the Allies to liberate their homeland. But initially there was fighting between the Vichy French, the Italians, the Germans, and the Americans. Local veterans who participated. This is Joe Fight from Miamisburg. Joe Fight was a parachute sergeant in the 509th Parachute Battalion. He joined the Army in 1941. He attended parachute school at Fort Benning, Georgia, 1941. This is a very new concept, parachuting. These guys were very brave, I'm telling you. Very new concept. They got $50 a month extra in 1941. That's why they did it. A private in the Army in 1941 got $18. Here's a picture of Joe Fight in his parachute. You can pass those around. Joe Fight joined the Army with his best friend from Miamisburg, Marion Shade. They both were assigned to the 509th Parachute Battalion. Joe Fight went on to make 8 campaigns in World War II. He was wounded 3 times, the Silver Star for gallantry. This is a sad story from the 509th Parachute Battalion. This is Robert Daves, and you got to make sure, your job is to make sure those get all the way around and they come back up here. This is Robert Daves from Drexel, North Carolina. Anybody ever been to Drexel? South of Gatlinburg, about 60 miles in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. Robert was the apple of his family's eye. There was 5 girls and 1 boy. He was the only boy. He joined the Army in 1941, became a parachutist. He was in the Operation Torch, flew from Land's End, England. His plane landed in an area occupied by the French Foreign Legion. The whole plane was captured by the Foreign Legion. So for 2 weeks they put him into one of these desert outposts, a castle, and they fed him, they treated him well. And at the end of 2 weeks, when they saw that the Vichy French were changing sides, they released him back to the Americans. He went on to do another combat parachute jump in North Africa. He then went on to Italy, and he was missing in action in the mountains of northern Italy and Venafro, Italy. Downstairs we have a massive display on him. I knew his sister. His sister died when she was 101 years old. And she wrote a book about her brother. We have hundreds of letters that he wrote. They're absolutely incredible. But he was found 6 years after the war ended. and then brought home and buried down in Drexel, North Carolina. So that's Robert Daves. You can pass Robert around, please. All right, you guys, you're responsible for making sure those get around and then get back up here. Thank you for your help today. We appreciate it. Give them a hand. Give them a hand. All right. I've got a dummy here, partial dummy, the kind that doesn't breathe or eat. This is a uniform that would have been worn. This was worn by a member of the 509th Parachute Battalion. This is called an M1942 parachute jacket. This is what the parachutists wore. It's cotton, it's baggy, it had 4 exterior pockets, and there's also a little interior pocket right here under the neckline. And in this pocket they carry a switchblade knife. It's funny because when the Germans captured these guys, it took them a long time to figure out that these guys all had switchblade knives in this little neckline pocket, because the next thing you know, they're brandishing the knives, stabbing the guards and getting away. But in the pockets they would carry rations, dry rations, sometimes canned, but usually if you carry canned rations and you do a parachute landing, you imagine what that feels like? Not fun. They would carry a compass. What's a compass for? Knowing where you're going. That's the key. You know, you got to know where you're at and where you're going. They would carry maps, silk maps, compasses. They would carry notepads, pencils. They would carry extra socks. The trousers had 2 large pockets on the sides, and those were stuffed full also. But they had a SOP. In the Army, anybody know what an SOP is? Standing operating procedure. So rather than a big gaggle coming in here, I'm going to take this, I'm going to take that, I'm going to take this. You have a standard operating procedure. This is what you'll carry as a parachute rifleman. This is where you'll carry it on your body. In the event that you're wounded or killed, your comrades know where that's at on your body, and they can take it away if they need it. Your rations, your first aid equipment. This is Les Green from the 509th Parachute Battalion. He's got his jump jacket, he's got a compass, he's carrying an M1 carbine made in Dayton. And let me remove something here. And we're going to talk about the war effort in the United States during World War II. But this is an M1A1 carbine with a folding stock. What it is a short rifle. It's good for about 100 yards. Anything after that, you can't see anything. So he was carrying this. It has a detachable magazine, which the magazine is what holds the rounds, and carries 15 rounds inside the magazine. He's carrying a pouch that carries ammunition. One of the things that the soldiers mostly carried when they went into combat was ammunition. Then they would get resupplied with food later. A parachutist, they'd be resupplied by air many times. So he's also carrying a musette bag. This is what you guys call packs. The musette bag, when they jumped, was worn underneath the reserve parachute. The musette bag is packed with extra clothing and ammunition. Mostly extra clothing consists of socks, lots of socks. Why do you think they carry lots of socks?
For their boots.
For their boots, because their feet do what when you march a lot?
They rub.
They get raw, they get wet. Your feet are your mobility. And if you're crippled, you can't complete your mission. He's also got a map case, and he's got a holster for a .45 caliber pistol. But these guys were little bitty people. That generation was about 4 to 5 inches shorter than we are now, and probably average weight was about 145 pounds. But when they parachuted out of those planes, sometimes they had 150 pounds of gear on them. So they're carrying a main parachute on their back, a reserve on the front. And next class, I'm going to be talking about D-Day. And we're gonna go into that, a little bit more of that in more depth and more detail. So, you got General Schaefer flying air cover. At the time was Lieutenant and Captain Schaefer. You got Joe Fight, you got Leslie Green, and you got Robert Daves fighting in North Africa. The Allies landed, the Vichy French collapsed. The Allies, the 519th, loaded up again, did another parachute drop in North Africa. They did another one, the third one in North Africa, where they seized a railroad bridge. It was really a debacle. It was bad. It was poorly executed. Most of them were captured or killed. And so the Allies are now poised up on the Tunisian frontier. And
Next week, Mr. Short will talk about the Italian campaign and D-Day.
so somebody tell me, are you gonna have anything to this?
I was just going to ask if there was any questions.
Somebody tell me right now, why was it important for the Allies to seize the continent of Africa? Any guesses?
Even the people on both sides of the Mediterranean.
That's a good reason.
If they had air mission planes to fly to Germany.
That's good. What about natural resources also, like oil? Exactly. The Africa Corps was threatening many of the oil fields throughout that region. The Africa Corps, by the way, was a special German unit composed of about 3 divisions. And we talked about Erwin Rommel, highly respected German officer. And with a small force, he was able to just basically cripple the British in Africa and its adjacent areas. So it was very important for us to get in there and secure Africa before we open up what's called the second front. The second front being the mainland of Europe. So next week, we're going to talk about D-Day. Anybody know anything about D-Day? I know some of you young, budding World War II historians know about D-Day. Tell us about D-Day.
It was a massive landing craft invasion on Normandy beaches. There's 5 Normandy beaches.
D-Day is referred, it's called D-Day. Every operation has a D-Day. A D-Day plus 1, plus 2, but we'll get into that next time. We have to also back up a little bit. We have to go to England. We have to look at that one little pinprick of light in the Sea of Darkness. All of Europe has been invaded by the Germans, and it's a sea of blackness. England held out. England was really crucial to the Allied war effort. So we're going to back up next week. We're going to talk about England. A fellow named General Dwight Eisenhower. Some of you may know about General Eisenhower. And we're going to talk about what the Americans and the British and the Allies completed on D-Day, June 6, 1944, to open up the second front. And we may have a couple of special guests. How many people remember Delbert? We have the European equivalents of Delbert coming next week. So I'm working on a D-Day medic, a gentleman who landed on D-Day, the first wave, and an infantryman who landed about a month after and fought there. So any questions about what we talked about today? We're back to 11:30 next week. I will be here, so be on time, be motivated physically, spiritually, mentally. Any questions about what we went over today? Yes, ma'am. Question? No question. Okay. All right.
Reading a book about early aviators, and they were talking about Doolittle, and I'd never heard this, but they said that when they came up with the plan, that he by himself came up to Wright Field, or Wright Airfield. Yeah, but it doesn't say what he was doing there.
General Doolittle?
Yeah.
General Doolittle, and Justin hit on this. General Doolittle was engaged in, it was aviation technology, trying to figure out ways to make the planes flyable for the mission. took off from an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. Very short takeoff. These two-engine B-25 bombers were not designed to take off from aircraft carriers. They were designed to take off from fixed runways on land. So he was up there, you know, figuring out ways to, in the manufacturing process and the modification process, to modify these planes and also experimenting with the tactics. And one of the things that he did was very simple but very ingenious. He simply measured the length of the aircraft carrier, the flight deck, and he would align that amount of distance on a runway, mark it off, and that's what the pilots had to keep training and training to beat that line at the end of the runway, because that technically was where the ship ended and the sea began. And one of the things you may not know, how many people know how many Doolittle Raiders are left today alive? There's 2 left. And as Justin said earlier, when they took off, they had enough fuel just to take off. They had no return plan. They took off, they flew over the Sea of Japan. They conducted target attacks in Tokyo. They carried small loads, but it was a propaganda effect, a terror effect. The Japanese were like, oh my God, what have we done? The Americans have attacked us now. But they flew on from Japan. They were shot down, ran out of fuel, or crashed in China. Some of their crews were captured and executed by the Japanese. Some of them escaped. But they were incredibly brave. The planes took off. They stripped all the armaments. They had no self-defense machine guns. They took out anything that had any weight. So, really an amazing feat of arms.
How many have been up to the Air Force Museum? Okay, have you ever seen the goblet glasses up there? Okay, the story behind that, after this all happened, and the reunions after the war, they got together and had these, and the brandy that was in there was supposed to be, not brandy, cognac, that was supposed to be open for the last soldier, the last one of Doolittle's raid to open it. A few years ago, there was 4 left at the time. 3 could only show up, and they actually opened that up, each one of them drunk out of their goblet, their cups. Now, when you go there, you'll see it open up with all the names on it, and no matter if you turn it upside down or right side up, you will always be able to read their name. So it was very important to them for what they did, and they felt that was important what they did. Now, getting back to Doolittle being up there at Wright Field, the reason he went up there is because of the wind. You ever been up there and notice how windy it is? He went up there and he says, at one time, the knots of seeing how strong the wind was is supposed to be the resistance that a B-25 would be getting wind off the ocean. If we left at this state, he figured there might be a chance this wind. That's how he added with the B-25s, could they stand it? That's the reason he went up there. And they kept that quiet for a long time because no one knew what he was doing. Only a few people knew what he was doing at the time. But if you ever get to go up to Wright Pat, go up there. And the big display up there with all the goblet cups and everything, and they talk about the reunion and what they did for the reunions and stuff.
And I think the goblets, when one dies, the goblets are turned upside down.
Yes. Yeah. When you turn,
It's the last man standing. The last guy is supposed to open the bottle and drink it. Well, they made an exception because there's 2 of them, and so the 2 survivors have opened I believe they've already cracked the bottle and drank the vino. So, or the, whatever it is. It's something you kids should not be drinking. Let me assure you. All right, any other questions? All right, 11:30 next Friday, the second front, D-Day. I want you guys, I may ask you some questions about this obscure fella named Dwight Eisenhower. And maybe